Hi there, welcome back to Lunch Bunch. I am reading a short story called Starlight and Moondust by Lori M. Hlee, and it is found in this collection of short stories called Color Outside the Lines, which is edited by Sangu Mandanna. So in this story, we've met Hlee, who lives in Little Nova, and she helps out an elder woman, a shaman, whose name is Niam Tais. Brings her dinner most nights. And now Niam Tais has a guest, a white teenager named Argus. So Hlee doesn't really know what his story is, who he is, where he came from. But she is intrigued by him, and he seems to be pretty nice, pretty okay. So we're going to continue on the story there and find out more about Argus and more about Hlee as well. For the next few days, Hlee and Argus took turns hacking at the sculpture in between feeding the chickens, weeding the garden, and sweeping the house. Once Niam Tais finished grinding all the herbs into a fine powder, she set Argus and Hlee to helping her partition, bag, and label them for sale. The general store set out Niam Tais' home remedies in a cute wicker basket beside the cash register, in between the lip balms and lighters. For the better part of her life, Hlee had done everything with her cousin. After her aunt's family moved away, they texted and called each other on weekends, but it wasn't the same. She hated to admit it, but having someone to hang out with again wasn't terrible. It helped that Argus was easy to talk to, partly because he took genuine delight in everything, even the most menial of chores, but mostly because he wasn't one of the townsfolk. Nothing she said or did with him mattered. She could let her guard down. Plus, after that first time, he didn't ask again for her story, or whatever that meant. Instead, he asked for other stories. Since topics of conversation were somewhat limited in Little Nova, she humored him. She began with the folk tales her mom used to tell, like the one about the trickster god who used cunning and wit to get out of obeying the emperor's commands, and the one about the rooster who won a crimson crown for its ability to sing back the sun every morning. The next week, Niam Tais sent them into the woods with a pail to gather pine cones for wreaths. They hadn't gone far before Hlee stumbled into a clearing and stopped breathing. Silver dust blanketed the entire space, coating every inch of earth and every tree facing inward. Patches of grass glowed like mounds of jewels in the sunlight. The air shimmered. What happened? Hlee breathed. She brushed a fingertip against a leaf. It left a luminous sheen. Setting down the pail, she stepped gingerly into the shining clearing. When she rubbed the silver from her finger, it disintegrated into a halo around her skin. Who would have done this? She asked. And why? Argus moved past her, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Flashing a grin, he sank down and sprawled onto his back. When he spoke, his voice was hushed with awe. It's like being caught inside a moonbeam. She knelt beside him, gazing upward so that her vision became nothing but silver and light. Directly overhead, several smaller branches had snapped, dangling limply. It looked as though something had smashed into them. It isn't like a moonbeam, she thought, with the sunlight amplifying every shimmering surface. She would have said it felt more like the heart of a star. The thought should have been embarrassing, but in this moment, wishing on stars didn't seem quite so silly. Do you believe in fairy tales? She asked abruptly. His gaze shifted to her. There were slight shadows beneath his eyes, as if he hadn't slept well. Fairy tales are stories. Yeah, but like the stories about falling stars. Would you make a wish? Brows furrowing in a rare instance of gravity, Argus seemed to seriously consider the question. He looked so natural lying there in the silver haze, the lines of his body fuzzy and indistinct, a creature of starlight and moondust. She realized she was staring when his mouth curved into a slow smile. Heat crawled up her neck. Well, he said, before the awkwardness could fully take hold, if I were a star, hurtling billions of miles per second through the atmosphere, I should think I'd be the last thing anyone would want to entrust with a wish. Hlee laughed, unable to look him in the eye again. That might be the first time anyone's considered a star's feelings. He crossed his ankles and stacked his hands behind his head, looking pleased with himself. Stories belong to everyone, not just the ones telling them. Hlee began to look forward to days spent with Niam Tais and Argus. On other days, she went into little Nova's tiny library to read, tucking away more stories to share with Argus and looking up medicinal herbs to better help Niam Tais. Every weekend, customers appeared at Niam Tais' doorstep, not just from Little Nova, but from all across the state, to purchase curatives for their aching joints and sore backs, bitter teas to chase away bad dreams, or to increase blood circulation. They came for other things, too. On those days, when Niam Tais hung fresh silver and gold joss paper and lit incense, chanting to the spirits as gray smoke curled through the altar room like a ghost, Hlee and Argus knew to make themselves scarce. They usually went to the clearing. The shine faded a little with each day, the natural greens and browns of the woods beginning to break through. With the earth still soaked from a recent downpour and the branches dripping rainwater into their hair and clothing, Argus stretched out again at the center of the clearing, unmindful of the dampness. Hlee folded her jacket before sitting on it to keep her jeans dry. She pointed at the translucent streak of a rainbow arching overhead. My mom used to say that rainbows are dragons, ridden by the gods through the heavens. Argus's face lit with interest, although his smile seemed less exuberant lately. The shadows beneath his eyes had darkened, and his pale skin held a slight gray pallor. And lunar rainbows? He asked. I didn't know that was a thing. Oh, it's a thing, he said, grinning. Rare, though. He rolled to face her, eyes closed as he scooted across the earth until he was all but curled around her folded legs, his elbow pillowed beneath his head. Will you tell me about the rainbow dragons? Despite the cool drip of rainwater down her neck, she felt suddenly warm and fleshed. Argus opened his eyes at her silence. When their gazes locked, something jolted through her, a white-hot flash of awareness. The air grew charged, heat gathering around them, as if, instead of starlight and moondust, he held all the brilliance of a dying star, engulfing her with the pull of his gravity. He rose from his recline. She looked away, but his fingers caught her chin. I like how you look at me. There's a story in your eyes that I would give anything to hear. Pulse racing, she couldn't meet his gaze. Too uncertain, even as every part of her became acutely aware of every part of him. Can I kiss you? He whispered. Hlee's breath rushed from her lungs in a shaky exhale as his lips pressed to hers. His mouth was hot, and it burned through her with the devastation of a supernova. The days passed in a blur. They touched hands beneath Niam Tais' table as they begged herbs. They soaked kisses behind the chicken coop between filling buckets with plump yellow cucumbers and red Thai chili peppers from the garden. And every moment they could spare, they fled to their clearing. It would have been idyllic if not for the way Argus's skin continued to lose its color. His eyes looked sunken, his hands frail. His once exuberant smile became more fleeting, brightest only when he held her tucked against him in their clearing, with the last remnants of silver dust glittering against their skin. Hlee worried about him, but didn't know how to ask what was wrong. So, instead, she held him tighter, pouring all her questions into the urgency of her kisses and the story she continued to tell whenever he asked. One night in mid-August, 2 months after Argus's arrival, after they'd had dinner with Niam Tais and helped clean the dishes afterward, Hlee took Argus's hand and led him through the woods to the edge of town. There they hid in the shadows of the trees and waited for Little Nova's end-of-summer festival fireworks to begin. Niam Tais had set up a tent to sell medicines, herbal teas, charms, and incense. The lantern they'd brought cast a yellow pall on Argus's already wan face. As the first fireworks shot into the sky with a high whine and exploded into brilliant color, Hlee opened her mouth to ask what was happening to him. Hey! Her mouth snapped shut. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, the harsh halo of a flashlight swinging over their feet. Amelia Hart stepped into the small circle of their lantern light, her friends flanking her. Argus, Amelia said, I'm so glad you came to see the fireworks. Hlee was glad no one was looking at her, because her mouth fell open, with the revelation that Amelia knew Argus's name. She shrank against the tree at her back, growing small to escape notice. It was like shoving herself back into an old skin, the desire to disappear almost unfamiliar after so many weeks of being seen. Argus's gaze passed from Amelia to her friends, his smile an echo of what it had been. Amelia, remember? She said. and she leaned over to pick up the lantern, setting it aside so she could sit. The shift instantly bathed Hlee in darkness. Is it true that you're actually living with the witch in the woods? What's that like? The question came out in a hush, as if they were friends, as if this wasn't the first time they'd spoken. If Argus replied, Hlee didn't hear it. Instead, the explosion of fireworks seemed to reverberate in her skull. She didn't care that Argus knew who Amelia was, but the way she and her friends gathered around him, as if they'd already claimed him as their own. The way they laughed, like they were all in on a joke that Hlee would always be excluded from. Hlee shoved to her feet and stumbled into the woods. Argus called her name, but she didn't stop running until she'd left them all far behind. Okay, we will pause there for today, and when we pick up again, we'll see what happens. I think with the conclusion, yes, we'll finish next time with the conclusion of Hlee and Argus's story. Thanks for watching. Bye.